We should start. We are now 96 participants. So I believe we should start. Beyond this, I think I'll go to the back end. After the introductions by Engineer Wandai, Engineer Wandai will introduce the speakers, and then Engineer Winnie Gishuru will take over from then. Thank you, Engineer. So go right ahead, Engineer Wandai.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, participants. My name is Engineer Peter Wandai, immediate past chairman of the Association of Consulting Engineers of Kenya. ASEC, through its Future Leaders chapter, previously known as a Young Professionals Forum, is actually taking a lead in this webinar. And this is going to be the first, or rather the second, amongst a series of webinars that ASEC will be hosting in partnership with the Engineers Board of Kenya. And all these webinars will be attracting CPD points. So those who are worried about the COVID situation and whether they will be able to achieve their CPD points with EBK this year, ASEC is proud to be hosting these webinars, which will help in the journey towards achieving these points. Today's webinar is on the subject of private-public, and my role in welcoming you is very simple. Actually, it's just to introduce the keynote speaker who is going to take us through this important topic of PPPs. I will introduce our guest speaker, Engineer Paul Karekezi. Engineer Karekezi is a chief executive of GIB Africa Limited, which is a firm responsible, and he is responsible for all work undertaken by the firm in East, Central, and West Africa. Paul is a member of the board of directors of GIB Africa Limited, responsible for business development, human resources development, corporate strategy, finance, and investment. Engineer Karekezi has over 40 years experience in infrastructure development in Africa and has extensive experience of training engineers in contract management and administration, with particular emphasis on FIDIC forms of contract. He has over 15 years experience in PPP, project development and implementation. Engineer Karekezi has extensive experience of designing and managing projects in the Africa region that have used various FIDIC forms of contract. He has acquired experience in the procurement of contractors, contract administration and evaluation, and adjudication of claims. He has been conducting formal training courses on the use of FIDIC forms of contract, including the Client Consultant Agreement, White Book, and the Rainbow Suite. He is a practicing adjudicator and arbitrator and serves as a member of the PPP Petition Committee in Kenya. Engineer Paul Karekezi holds a BSc in Civil Engineering. Engineer Paul Karekezi holds a BSc in Civil Engineering, a global MBA, and an LLM, that is a Master of Laws, in Construction Law, Arbitration, and Adjudication. He is a member of the Institution of Engineers of Kenya, a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers of the United Kingdom, a chartered engineer by the Engineering Council of UK, and he's a professional consulting engineer by the Engineers Board of Kenya. He is also an accredited mediator from the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and a fellow of the same institute, that is a Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Engineer Karekezi is also a certified public-private partnership specialist, IP3, and a CPP approved trainer by APMG International. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Engineer Paul Karekezi to take us through this very important webinar today. So Engineer Winnie Gishuru, I'll hand over to you to moderate the session as Engineer Karekezi takes over. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Engineer Wandai. Good afternoon, everyone. And Yes, welcome to this session for the on public-private partnership by Engineer Karekezi. It will be a fairly 2-hour session, and we'll be covering mostly on the projects on the PPP. We'll go through the introduction. We'll look into the PPP Act in Kenya, and then as we move along, what I'll request is that we'll be having, each section will be taking roughly 5 to 10 minutes. And then after every section, we'll take like a few questions, whereby if you can, or not if you can, we suggest that you use the chat option to post in your questions, which then we can actually consolidate and ask Engineer Karekezi as he moves from one session to another. And if you're able to do that, we'll be able to move along quickly. And then at the end, you'll also still have a session where you can still ask your questions. So I highly request all of you to use the group chat to ask your questions or any comments that you'd like to make in between sessions. So without further delay or anything, I'd like to welcome Engineer Karekezi to start off the session and give us introduction and get us through this presentation and webinar. Welcome, Engineer.
Thank you, Winnie. Good afternoon, engineers. This is a fairly broad subject. I'll do my best to try and compress everything within 2 hours, which is not easy. As Winnie said, we'll have sessions, to ask questions. I suggest that please, at the end of this session, only ask questions which are pertinent to what I will have presented. So I'll first of all start by, talking about what PPP is, because it doesn't mean the same thing to everybody, unfortunately. But briefly, PPP is a partnership. It's a partnership between the public sector and the private sector. In other words, a government or a government entity and a private entrepreneur who wants to take a little bit of risk. So there must be mutual benefit for it to happen. Otherwise, why have a partnership? And the benefits must be identified. Otherwise, if they're not well identified, then why even bother with the partnership itself? And there must be commitment for mutual gain. It's a marriage. PPPs are long-term. You're talking about anything between 25 years to 30 years that you have to live with one another. So there has to be commitment to relationship, and there must be mutual gain for it to survive. Now, there isn't a common definition of PPP. It doesn't exist. In fact, because of that, most pieces of legislation that cover PPP would define what a PPP is within the context of that jurisdiction. But there are general, shall we say, elements that you'll find in every PPP definition. First and foremost, it's going to be long-term. It's a long-term contract. The private entity would normally be responsible for the design, the building, financing, operation, and maintenance. And the revenues are normally tied to performance. So it will be in the form of user charges. I'll probably talk about this a bit more as we proceed. It could be direct payment by the government, or it could be a combination of the two. What I mean by user charge, if you remember toll roads, we had time back, when you're paying a toll, that's what user charge would be. And even though there is a private party providing a service, the ownership of the asset would normally remain in the hands of the government. But there's only one exception. There's one form of PPP called build, own, and operate, where the operator owns the asset. And I'll explain why that is the case. Now, how does this relationship look like? So this is a very simplified form of a PPP structure. It's a lot more complex than this. But for the benefit of this webinar, I just produced something quite simple. So you'll have a government agency up there. You'll have what they call a project company. I'll talk a bit more about that later on, which is the one that enters into an agreement with the government. The project company will then have equity investors, and you'll have lenders because they go to borrow. And then below that, you go downstream contracts, which is a contract between the project company and the EPC contractor who does the engineering, the procurement, and the construction. And then you have another contractor also be the same, providing the O&M services. Now, just to explain or a bit more about what a PPP is, I thought I'd look at a graphic which gives a continuum between, from a pure public entity type of service provider right through to a pure private. So you find that, say, for example, if the government retains cleaning services for their offices, that is not a PPP. A management contract we had a few years back with KPLC, that is not a PPP. Design build contracts, those are not PPPs. Why is that? Because all of them are short term. And you remember the definition of PPP, it has to be a long-term contract. There has to be a significant amount of, of risk being transferred. Now, when you look at things like, say, unfortunately didn't go through, but the contract for provision of university hostels at Kenyatta University, as an example, that is a PPP. Why? Because a lot of the risk has been moved from the public sector to the private sector in terms of financing, in terms O&M, and so on. If you look at geothermal plants, IPPs, they are PPPs for that reason. RVR concession, which unfortunately went belly up, that is a PPP. But if you look at, say, Safaricom, or if you look at Airtel, those are pure private. There is no, the government may be there as a shareholder, but in terms of the definition of PPP, it doesn't fit in because basically that is a private investment and basically there's no partnership. So, sometimes you find that people don't differentiate the difference between a private sector providing a service to the government, but it's a short-term contract, and the long-term contract, which is the PPP. And as I move on, I'll explain how our legal system has dealt with it. So by way of maybe trying to explain a bit more about the different types of contracts that we have in PPPs, you got what they call a DBFOM, which is design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. And this one is normally for new assets. And generally, it is either in terms of payment mechanism, say the government paying directly, or to user charges. You've got operation and maintenance on its own. For example, we're looking at, or some time back, we looked at Thika Road, we looked at the Southern Bypass, where the government had developed the asset, and we're going to procure a PPP just to provide operation and maintenance. You've got bill, operate, transfer, and so on. Now, I will not bother you, going through all of them. By the way, I think this, I would make these slides available, and I presume that Acek will be able to share them with you. So I will not spend too much time on each one of them, but all those different nomenclature, they've got a reason why they're there, and they normally address the type of function that is required. What sort of risk are you transferring from the public sector to the private party? So in short, that's what a PPP is. But what's the rationale? Now, when I talk about the rationale of a PPP, I'm talking about it from the standpoint, looking at this sub-Saharan Africa, not just Kenya alone. Because what I found is that we share the same issues, whether it is West Africa, ourselves here, or Southern Africa, we find the same issues. So what are the issues? The issue is that this area, our land, is burdened with debt. Debt which we are finding very difficult to sustain. If you look at the small box I put down there, we're showing basically the ratio of the debt to our GDP. And you can see that some countries, their debt to GDP ratio is up to 75%. It's not a sustainable level of debt. So therefore, in terms of being able to balance the needs against the resources available becomes a problem. The tax revenues, the tariffs that we have, whatever transfers that we can get, that the government can get, is not enough to deal with the needs vis-a-vis our infrastructure requirements. So basically, it's a quagmire. You've got low tax revenues, got high sovereign debt, got high domestic borrowing, and raising public expenditure demands. And to couple that, on top of all that, we've got a few little problems. Yeah, we have, if you look at our infrastructure problems, they're always delayed generally. There's cost overrun, poor maintenance, poor design. We don't select our projects very well, not always. And of course, the issue of corruption, we know it's a fact that we need to face. And that is not helping our ability to develop our infrastructure. So what does this mean? Basically, because of the fact we've not been investing in infrastructure for a long time, we find that today, this region requires an investment of $92 billion per year for the next decade if we're able to catch up with, at least achieve reasonable level of infrastructure. Because what happens is this: by so doing, the GDP of sub-Saharan Africa will grow by 2.6% per annum. Now, what does that mean? You grow your GDP, it means you're basically creating wealth. And today in Africa, about 14 million young people are joining the workforce. If your economy is not growing, if your GDP is not growing, you cannot find employment for them. So it makes a lot of sense to make that investment so you can create employment opportunities for our young people. So how does PPP help? Well, it does a couple of things. I've just noticed that Sammy moved down. So what PPP will do for you, it will address the issue of poor planning, the things I've just talked about. So the issue of low quality will disappear. Why? Because the private sector will carry a very rigorous analysis and innovation. There is a reason why they do that. We'll get rid of delayed projects delivery. So we deal with inefficiency and effective delivery, because the private sector has got an incentive to avoid delays. Remember, I talked about payments being linked to performance. So they want to be able to deliver that project as soon as possible so they can start earning as soon as possible. We'll deal with the low reliability, the issue of maintenance, because they have a liability of, say, 25 to 30 years. They make sure that whatever they build will not require a lot of operation and maintenance. So you'll find that the service is reliable and is provided as required. Finally, it provides the funding we require. Because, as I said, the free tax of tax or from our development partners and so on, we cannot find the $92 billion per annum that we require. So the private sector can provide that money. So that is to do with basically what PPP is and the rationale for PPP. So I'll stop here. That was the first section. Over to you, Winnie.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I can't see anyone who's posted a question, but the first thing that comes to my mind is, yes, we're talking about the PPP. If we go back, we started off in Kenya, privatization. If you can touch on that, what's the difference between PPP and privatization? As in, like, I saw that line, but how would you actually, yes.
Okay, all right. You see, this road towards PPP started about more than 30 years ago, probably 40 years ago, driven mostly by the World Bank and IMF. And the way I think is that the government parastatals were very inefficient and were avenues for corruption. So how do you deal with it? Basically privatize it. Get government out of commercial functions so that you hand that over to the private sector. So the first thing they tried was privatization. But all the NGOs were up in arms. You know, you are selling the family's jewels. Forget about it, not acceptable. So it became unpalatable to the public. It just couldn't work. So PPP, quite frankly, is privatization, but in a different form. In the sense that, yes, you're handing over the asset to the private party to generate revenue and provide a service for a period of time of 30 years, 25 years. And then the asset eventually reverts back to the government. In reality, it may never, because what you might do is probably to extend the PPP. So really, there is no much difference per se in reality. The only thing is that it sounds different and the mechanics is different in the sense that when it came to privatization, the assets were sold 100% off the government balance sheet, they are gone. Okay, and the only thing that the government role only became regulatory, to provide the regulatory framework. In this particular case, not only does the government provide a regulatory framework, but they also monitor performance in terms of quality and so on. So those are basically the only two differences.
Okay. Anyone? Any questions? A quick one. The oil exploration in Turkana, would you consider it a PPP or it's a private investment?
Okay. In fact, if you look at our law, there is a small problem there. One, I can't remember which section it is, but it talks about minerals and mining being covered by this particular act, but it should not be. Although you talk about, say, a concession, like a mining concession or an oil concession, it's a different type of concession, and that's covered by a different law. It's actually a different ministry. So it is not a PPP. It is not, if you look at the definition of PPP, which I'll come to in a short while, you find that it does not fit under the definition of PPP. So it is not.
Okay.
It is a concession, but it is not a PPP.
Okay. Because this was just an introduction section. I think as we move along, I think more questions will be coming in, or more comments as we get into the meat of the matter, if you can say it. So I think it's okay if we can move forward, and then as we continue, we can actually continue consolidating the questions for you. Is that okay?
Very well. Okay, so I want to talk about our, shall we say, our road to where we are today. For a start, PPPs did not start in 2013 when we enacted our law. In fact, we had a PPP going back to 1959. Some of the older people in this forum, and some of us probably remember when you used to cross, going to Nyali using a wooden structure. And we paid. A car paid, an ox paid, and so on. That was a private party that had land both sides. They built that platoon, and they were charging. It was actually PPP. So we lost it along the way. And the next time we saw anything close to a PPP was when the IMF and the World Bank stopped supporting us, particularly supporting the power sector back in the 90s. If I know whether you remember, we had very serious power blackouts and so on. And that's when we now embrace the issue of IPPs, independent power producers. By that time, we didn't have a law. So everything was done by contract. But the model was very similar to what our law has today. So then, come 2008, we decided, you know what, we are talking about Vision 2030, but how are we going to finance it? Because when they cranked out the numbers, they just found that, in fact, for us to reach Vision 2030 by year 2030 at that time, we had to invest something like $44 billion in infrastructure, which we didn't have. So the only avenue seemed to be to bring in the private sector to provide the financing. So we produced at that time a policy statement. But just before that, there was a guidance note for screening project was produced in 2010. So we had our policy statement in 2011, which was followed by the law itself in 2013. Then we had the regulations, and a suite of regulations followed after that. And I'll explain why we have all those pieces of legislation. So how do they relate to each other? Basically, we've got the act over there, which was basically developed from the policy. And then out of the act came a suite of regulations. We have a PPP manual still in draft form. We hopefully should get it soon. Then we've got a financial management acts, which basically are required to make sure that we don't overcommit ourselves. I'll just give you, I'll probably talk about that later on about a project in Lesotho, which is nearly bankrupting the country. So we need to have a financial management wrapped around the whole of this process to ensure that we do not overstretch ourselves in terms of commitment. So what has the law created? It created an institutional arrangement that's basically starts off with a PPP committee, and then you've got a PPP unit, which is below the committee, and then you've got nodes. Nodes are within all the entities which are allowed by law to contract. In other words, they call them contracting authorities under the law. So, and then on the side, in case people don't have an issue with the procurement process, they can then come to a petition committee to complain if, say, for example, in terms of shortlisting, they're not shortlisted, or in terms of award is an issue. They come to this committee. As a committee have been sit on, and the last day is tomorrow. And then on the left, you can see debt management office. That management office basically there, the gatekeeper, to ensure that whatever commitment the government is going to make, it is affordable. The government can afford it. And you find that the commitments are in two forms. Involve fiscal commitment, that's where the government has to make a budget provision and pay probably every quarter or every half year. And what they call contingent liabilities. These are liabilities which may or may not materialize. For example, we provide a letter of comfort. That letter of comfort says, it gives some comfort to the private party that if certain events happen, that the government can step in. For example, Kinangop. When Kinangop went belly up, there was a letter of comfort, there was actual arbitration, demanding a lot of money. Lucky enough, we managed to win the case. But had we lost the case, it will of course the government a lot of money because of that commitment. So the debt management office looks at all that before a PPP project is given a note to proceed. Now, what does the structure of the Act look like? It basically has 12 parts. There is one which deals with preliminaries. And so now I'm doing this intentionally because we as engineers tend not to read the law, which I think we should. We should read that law and understand what the law states. So it's got 11 parts, one deals with preliminaries. Then you've got the next part, which basically establish the lines of authority within government on the management of PPP contracts. The next part creates an enforcement mechanism to ensure the PPP transactions are treated fairly and they are consistent. So basically, the rules of the game are made clear. Then you've got the next part identifies and also involves preparation of PPP projects. How do you prepare them? How do you identify a PPP project? The next two sections deal with stakeholders, and investors. Tells them, if it's a solicited bid, these are the rules. So how you do solicited bids. Now, what I mean by solicited is when it is competitively bid. Then you got those which are unsolicited. What is the procedure? Then the next part, which is part 9, deals with project agreements. What constitutes a project agreement? What should you include, and so on. Then there's some financial provisions with the project facilitation fund and deal with financial reporting and auditing of a PPP project. There are some miscellaneous provisions which allow, for example, the government to inspect PPP premises. And the last one is basically looks at the law, the 2013 law, and say, does it conflict with any other existing laws? And then that particular section deals with it. So for example, the Public Procurement Asset Disposal Act of 2015 does not apply to PPPs. I've seen instances where a client or a public body starts by shortlisting people using the 2015, and then they want to procure a PPP under 2013. It does not work. So the two of them have got no relationship at all. If you're going to procure a PPP, you only look at 2013, 2015 does not come into play. Now, let me look at the PPP process.
Can I come in? Sorry, Paul. On the PPP process. Yes.
Okay.
Just to bring you back. As you said, you've accused, engineers that you don't read the law or the regulations. I'm not sure whether people know currently there was public engagement on the toll for the roads for the engineers. Was that part of the PPP committee initiative, or is it something that the government actually goes just, how do I put it?
Okay.
The involvement, what was the role of it?
You're talking about the tolling, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, that is under the Road Act, from what if I'm correct, I think it's the Road Act, because what the government decided is that anything, say like, for example, to do with tariff setting, instead of it sitting under the PPP Act, it was thought better to be under the relevant, shall we say, ministry. If it's transportation, it's under transportation. If it's water, it should be under the Water Act. So yes, it is somehow related to the PPP Act, because we're talking about a private party collecting a toll. Our law did not envisage a private party collecting a toll. And that's what that regulation is about, is to allow it, in brief, is to allow a private party to be able to collect a toll. Tolls have always been there before, but those were being collected by a government entity, not a private entity.
I don't think there's anyone. I don't know why. There's another question. Okay, back to the media on that part, on the enactment. You mentioned the letter of comfort, giving an example of the Kinango wind farm.
Yes.
And there's how do I put it? In the media, I don't know whether it was just this year, they were saying the government is changing policy, rechecking on whether they shall be issuing letter of comfort to all projects. Is that something that is it's covered under the PPP Act, or it's something the government just, I can say the minister can decide, something like that?
Yeah. The letter of comfort is provided for under the PPP Act. It's one of the instruments that the government can provide. But this letter of comfort is sort of, as it says, a letter, basically a letter. But over the years, it is morphed into more or less a guarantee. If you look at the wording of the letter, they put so much, the way they are written, you cannot distinguish them, from being a letter of comfort and being a guarantee. So I think it's being rethought again, because I think the lesson we learned from Kinago was fairly scary. So it's being rethought. It's supposed to be a letter of comfort, not a guarantee, as it morphed to be.
Okay. There's someone who wants to clarify on something about, I think on the toll, that's Kefa. I don't know whether Nancy can allow him. He wants to clarify something.
On who? Kefa? What's
Kefa Odhiambo.
Kefa Odhiambo. I've unmuted Kefa Odhiambo.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thanks to Paul for taking us through the subject. I just wanted to make a clarification on the legislative instrument that was being subjected, that was recently subjected to public participation, and that was the National Toll Fund Regulation. These were regulations that are being put in place to allow the management of the toll fund, where all revenues collected from all the toll roads will be taken into. We have another set of legislative amendment that will also be subjected to public participation, but that is currently in Parliament. And that's what Engineer Paul spoke about, amendments now to allow us to undertake tolling on toll roads. Long time ago, we used to have the Public Roads Toll Act. And basically, that was a statute that was put in place to allow collection of transit tolls, more so for foreign vehicles. So what we've done is to amend it to allow us, to allow the law to be robust enough, to allow us to collect tolls from any other road that can be declared as a public toll road by the cabinet secretary responsible for roads at the time being. So that's one set of legislative that will be coming to the public for public participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kefa.
Yep.
Yeah, maybe if I may just clarify, maybe Kefa might not remember this, but we had toll stations where everybody, even private cars, had to pay tolls. Not necessarily, transit. Transit was later on, but before, all of us were paying tolls. So I think the main thing is to allow a private party to carry out that function. I would imagine is the main issue within that piece of legislation.
Yes, thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. Paul, I think we can move on.
Okay, so now I'm not going to go through the whole act, but there are a couple of things that I want to bring out. One, first of all, is the definition of PPP. If you remember, I said there isn't a universal definition. There are elements which are common, but you find that every piece of legislation in general will have its own definition. So it talks about, let me break it down. That's what it says, but let me break it down as I move forward. It talks about an arrangement. So it is a contract signed between a contracting party and a private party subject to the laws of Kenya. It talks about a contracting authority, which basically means a state department, agency, state corporation, or county government, which intends to have a function undertaken by it performed by a private party. So you're basically vesting that, shall we say, service or that requirement in a private party. Then there's a definition of private party. What is a private party? It means a person that enters into a project agreement with a contracting authority and is responsible for undertaking a project on behalf of the contracting authority, but under this particular act. It cannot just be something which is outside the 2013 Act. But what is the public function? What is service? A public function or service means that the government is legally, it's one which the government is legally mandated to ensure they are provided. Now, there was a question earlier on as to whether the Turkana oil, that concession, is it a PPP? It isn't. Because the thing is this, where is the service being provided? First of all, where is the requirement that the government must provide that service? And which service is being provided? And then the next one is benefits. The benefit means the income or payment that the private party receives. So there are actually three ways of dealing with it. One is what they call availability-based, or in this country, we tend to call it annuity program. I think out of the annuity program under the road sector. And basically it is the private party undertakes to build the road, if it's a road, operate and maintain it, and then they get paid a certain amount of money either every quarter or half a year. But there are certain things that are applied to the calculations, so on. But that money comes from taxes, comes from government, not from users. It's what is revenue-based, where basically the private party puts up his tolls. It could be physical, or they may not necessarily be physical tolls, the mechanism that they adopt, and they charge the road users to recoup the investment and pay off the loan. But you could also have a combination of the, we have a revenue-based, there's a fee being charged to users, and then topped up with some form of payment from government. So those are the three methods which are allowed for under our law. So there are a couple of things I just want to look at in terms of what the law provides in terms of the PPP process. Now, the law states that if the unit finds or determines that the contracting authority does not have the capacity to run the procurement process, or at least in the preparation of the project and the procurement process, then they may go ahead and they will require the contracting authority to procure the services of a transaction advisor. But what does this animal do? Basically, it's like a usual, like the consultants you have working, say, for Kenya or the water authorities, where they are probably doing design or feasibility studies, design and tender documentation. So what the TA does, they basically come in to assist the contracting authority to develop a project which has been identified and approved. Okay, so it's on the list, been approved. They develop it, so that they can take it to market. Now, taking it to market means they can try and procure a private party. Now, I will not go through all these sections and the regulations. You can read them in your own time once you get the slide. The next one is a procedure for the government has already prepared the project, the tender documentations are ready, and they want to go to the market. So it's got a whole process: invitation for qualification, how you qualify the private party, the committee for pre-qualification, how do you disqualify a party, and so on, all the way to the evaluation of bids. And the way that is structured is that you have both technical and financial bid being submitted. The technical bids are first of all evaluated, and when you go through that hurdle, that's when your financial proposal is open. And it continues. So you've got the evaluation system, scoring system, the requirement for bid security. How, under what basis can you reject a bid? If somebody doesn't go through the technical hurdle, then the financial offer is returned. The issue of bid security: how do you return the bid securities? How do you open the financial proposal? How are they evaluated? There's a requirement for preparation and evaluation reports. There is a requirement that you should not restrict innovation, because the whole idea of PPPs, I talked about earlier on about innovation. I think I repeated a couple of times. You're trying to benefit from the innovation that the private sector is going to bring on board. So give them the latitude. Define what the end product should be. Define what the performance should be, but don't tell them the how. So define the what at the end of the day, the how is theirs. So you encourage innovation. It talks about negotiations as well. Then it goes through, how you prepare your risk matrix as part of the report, which will go to the unit from the contracting authority. Then once you go through all that process, then eventually there is a memorandum to the cabinet. Then there is, now this is where I was saying that was an error in the act, where it talks about exploitation of natural resources under section 55. This is wrong, it's in the wrong place. That is not a PPP. And then it's issue of the approval of the project, execution of a contractor that cannot say the person for cancelling tenders and under what circumstances. And then what tends to happen is this: the group which is submitting the offer, the consortium, is not the one that eventually signs the contract. Remember the graphic I showed at the beginning? That consortium is required by law to form a limited liability company. And that's the company that then enters into a contract agreement with the government entity. There's a requirement that once a contract is awarded, once you just sign the contract, what they call commercial, that's when you sign the agreement, there's a requirement that the information is made public. Unfortunately, it hasn't. I've not seen it being made public at all on all the PPPs that I'm aware of. Then there's an issue of performance security. That's a requirement under the Act as well. So finally, let me talk about the different process. This one is to do with what we call unsolicited proposals, or what we call in our law, privately initiated investment proposals. So what is this? This is where basically a private party looks at the requirements of government, or looks at a need that the government is trying to deal with, and either the government is not proceeding because it hasn't got the funds, or the government hasn't quite figured out maybe the best solution, and a private party comes forward and say, here, I think I can solve your problem. I can deal with your pain. Here is my proposal. So the section 61 of the Act goes through and gives you a process as to how you deal with unsolicited proposals. Now, this is not the default position in the Act. The default position is solicited proposal, otherwise competition. But there are instances where PIIPs do happen, We have an example in Mombasa, the crossing of the Likoni channel. Somebody came up with the PIPP, which is basically using cable cars. I don't know how far it is going so far, but they moved quite a bit. So I think I will stop there as far as the Act is concerned, but I will encourage you to please read the Act and understand it if you want to be this space. Over to you, Winnie. Winnie, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I'm still muted. Sorry. Thank you. That was on the PPP Act, the processes that have been allowed for, and the procedures used in the PPP process in Kenya, and how that has been captured within the Act. We have two types of proposals, as Paul has said: solicited, which is where the government has initiated the project, and unsolicited, whereby you have a private entity coming in and doing a proposal to the government. So far, I've not seen any questions on that, but let me ask, okay, coming up, questions like SGR. Was that a PPP? And can you say, was it solicited or unsolicited?
So which one again?
SGR? Yes.
No. SGR is basically traditional contracting towards design and build. The only difference there was that it was a funding mechanism, which I understand to be government to government, a loan from the Exim Bank of China. And it's really a loan that the government has taken. It's just traditional contracting, only that was design and build.
Okay, I don't know how to ask for further clarification. Okay, because what we understand, it is it's a government to government funding, if I can say that. But the operation and the building company.
O&M, the same company that did the construction has now been retained to do O&M from somebody close to that. So I am not privy to what exactly the arrangements were, but the O&M is being provided by a private entity on behalf of Kenya Railways. I don't know how long that arrangement is for, and I believe the payment mechanism is based on not necessarily on user charges. Of course, we pay for it, but I believe that the operator gets paid a certain amount of money. If I go by what the newspapers have indicated, they get paid a certain amount of money every month. So it looks like an availability type of arrangement, but under O&M.
Okay, I hope that's clear for Bernard. Okay, a question comes in. You explained the Act defines the administrative structure gate to keep on behalf of the government. What is the criteria to evaluate what project qualifies or accepted for PPP? As what are the key indicators?
Right, now, I didn't cover that. So basically, when you are doing your identification and as well as evaluation of the project, there are a couple of things that actually key indicators that the law provides for. The first one is there value for money? What does value for money mean? In brief, it means suppose the project was done by the government using traditional contracting, how much would it cost the government? That is one, so public sector cost. Then you say, but if a PPP does it, what is their cost? But remember, with the PPP, you have moved certain risks from the government to the private party. So you've got to get a public sector comparator that takes into consideration the costs, the value or the cost of those risks which have moved to the private party. Now, you compare those two. So the risk adjusted, public sector cost against the offer that you've received from the public party. If the public party's offer is lower than what the risk-adjusted public sector comparator is, then that difference is called value for money. And if it is positive, then you can go ahead. But if it is higher, meaning the difference, the value for money is negative, then our law does not allow you to proceed. But there is a question. If you don't have the money, you've done all that exercise, you don't have the money, and you still need the project yesterday. So what do you do? I will address that later on. So the other one is to do with affordability. Can you afford it? Even if it is user pay, you do your willingness to pay when you're doing your feasibility study and see what people can afford to pay. If the willingness to pay is much, the amount they're willing to pay is much lower than what it's going to cost if you do a PPP, then you don't go forward unless you do a couple of things. You can make it affordable by providing what they call viability gap financing, so that the government pays some of the cost to make it affordable. But affordability is one of the other criteria. Obviously, it's going to be socially responsible. So from an environmental perspective, from a social perspective, it has to be acceptable. So that's how you make your decision whether to procure using the traditional procurement mechanisms or to procure it using a PPP model.
Okay. Some of the questions are coming in now on financing and structure. So I think, and quality assurance. Okay, just a quick one. Unsolicited proposal. Do you have another example apart from the cable car? What about what was it called? The Nairobi-Mombasa Expressway. Was that unsolicited? Or
first of all, that did not come as a PPP. It came as a traditional contracting. Eventually, the government decided they wanted it to be a PPP, and that's what it is at. But it started off as a traditional contracting proposal using US funding.
Okay. Okay. I think we can proceed because of time. I think we'll.
But there are a few unsolicited proposals in the power sector. Okay. Mostly people proposing solar in Western Kenya and so on. Those are coming in as unsolicited.
Okay, that's a question for later as we try and frame it. I think we can move on, and then we can capture the rest of the questions later during the preliminary, the end discussion.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is the issue of financing and funding mechanism. Now, these words tend to be used interchangeably, but in fact, they're very different. So financing is basically the money you need upfront to meet the cost of construction of infrastructure. That's financing. And generally, that will come about by the private party raising money in the form of debt. Remember that small graphic I gave you, I mentioned earlier, I was showing lenders on one side and then equity providers on the other. So that's where the financing comes from. You've got debt, which can be anything between 60 and 80%, 80%. Sometimes it can even go up to 90%, depending on how risky the lenders see the project to be. And then you've got equity, which is of course the difference between what is required and the debt which is procured. So that's financing. But funding is different. Funding is to do with payment to the investor, to the concessionaire, so they can meet their debt obligations, they can meet their operation maintenance costs, and of course get, hopefully at the end of the day, some kind of return. So this one is normally funded by taxes if it is government pay. Remember one of the options I mentioned, like annuity program, that's government pay, those are from taxes. It could be from user charges, which I've discussed earlier, or it could be a combination of the two. So that's what in this country so far, as far as I know, we're looking at, it's been more or less government pay. Because you may say, well, what about IPPs? It's KPLC, but KPLC is not too far from government. So in terms of pure user charges, I don't know of any at the moment. Most concessionaires, I think, are not yet, I think, comfortable with just relying on user charges, maybe because of probably issues of affordability and so on. But so far, it has been government pay. But there are other models elsewhere. There are other mechanics that we could look at, which that is now I'm looking purely in terms of financing, which maybe we need to start looking at. One of them is to do with establishing an infrastructure vehicle at the capital market, so that then you can do some, we call it crowdfunding, where institutions like pension funds, insurance companies can put their money in. Now, if you really think about it, the needs of a pension fund and the needs of a PPP are very, very much, there's a lot of synergy. I mean, the needs are similar. Let me explain what I mean by that. The pension fund wants to invest in a long-term instrument, which will be able to provide, constant cash flow when required, or at least growth when required. The PPP also is looking for long-term financing, which commercial banks cannot provide. So therefore, if you can bring the two of them together, it becomes very complementary. But unfortunately, today our law doesn't allow it as yet. But there is something in the works. We've got a lot of money sitting with pension funds and insurance companies that could be utilized to develop PPP projects in the country. And there is a huge benefit about that. And what is this benefit? Currency risk. If we can finance our PPP projects using Kenya shillings, then we will de-risk the project very significantly from the perspective of foreign currency. At the moment, the projects I've seen so far, the government bears the currency risk. So every time the shilling goes up and down, I mean, you see it on your electricity bills, for example. Whenever the bill comes in, there is a cost, something to do with exchange, foreign exchange. So we can get rid of that if we're to finance the project using Kenya shillings. And this is one way of doing it. There is another model which is very similar, but it's a variant. It's called to do with capital contribution. And you find that in Australia, it's one of them. And what happens here is that the government, or there is a fund which is provided, but it is disbursed on a pro rata basis. So if you spend a bit of your equity, I'll also spend part of my of the VG I'm giving you. It could be delayed drawdown where the money is accessed after maybe you've gone halfway or 1 year down the road. There's a project I'm involved with where the documents required the drawdown to be made in four years, so 25% every year. It was a 4-year construction. And then the other one could be upon completion or reaching specific points in the construction. The other one is the inverted bid model. And what this is about, what tends to happen, at least so far in our region, is that the concessionaire goes to the banks, goes to the lenders, and they discuss and agree terms, then they put in a bid. Then if they win, then they go back to the funder and have further discussions, and hopefully the deal goes through. We've had our own issues with Kenyatta University, where it's been been stuck for many years because we cannot reach what they call financial close. In other words, they're not able to access debt because maybe conditions were not favorable. So what do they do in Australia? They basically, instead of bidding the concession per se, they first of all bid the financing. So get financiers to bid before tendering for construction, operation, and maintenance. So therefore, by the time the bids come in, you know how much it's going to cost you, what will be the cost of finance. That could be quite useful in our environment. The other one is the establishment of active bonds. Again, this is to do with taking advantage of tax-free or tax-exempted bonds. That again can be very beneficial if you're able to access money which is tax exempt. So there are a few examples in the US. The last one is to do with the non-profit distribution model, and you find that in the United Kingdom, in Scotland in particular. So the equity is not distributed, but the private sector returns are capped, and any surplus that you have is returned to the government to offset availability payments. In the United Kingdom, they've got what they call PFI, and the private, the PFI is basically an availability, or in our case, what we call annuity, where the private party is paid a certain amount of money either per quarter or per year. So basically, any excess returns are used to offset payments which the government will make to the private party. Not a bad model. I think something we could look at. Over to you, Winnie.
Okay, thank you. That was on financing and funding of PPPs, the mechanisms that are available within Kenya and what other countries are actually adopting. So the question, I think one of the things that is coming out of asked is, are there any legal impediments that are there that are making financing of roads, like as in, is there anything that's preventing commercial banks and pension funds from financing roads? Okay, let's say like the annuity, as you're saying. Is it the legislation? Is it the actual credit market the way it is? What is it that is actually, okay, in my opinion, I think the biggest issue we have in PPP in sub-Saharan Africa is financing. How do we get, I get the many forms that you've given, but what is it that is actually preventing us from getting to that financial closure?
Okay, as I mentioned, the law doesn't allow pension funds at the moment as it stands to invest in PPPs. If you look at the RBA Act, it's very specific as to where the money can go to. It's all intended to protect people's pensions. So until the law is changed and until the PPPs are seen not to be too risky, I think it makes sense to allow pension funds to invest in PPPs. They're sitting on our money and the returns are very low. They could get higher returns if they did. Now, in terms of commercial banks, they've got two issues. Issue number one, the term of their loans is very short. As I said, PPPs will run for 25 to 30 years. You need a long-term instrument or a long-term source of finance. And commercial banks, if you are really lucky, you'll go to 7, maybe if you will push it, maybe 10 years. So that's one problem, the tenure. The other problem is understanding. Most of them do not understand PPPs. PPPs are based on what they call project financing. Maybe I should have mentioned that earlier. And what do we mean by project financing? Basically, the investor and the lender will only get their money back based on the cash flows generated by the asset. So, if you look at investors who create company, the project company, their liability ideally will be limited to the equity investment they put into the vehicle. That's all. The balance sheet of their companies are kept safe, kept away from that. Okay, sometimes you find you don't get 100% non-recourse financing. The lenders may require some kind of guarantees from the promoters. But it's essentially most of the funding will come from the cash flows. So our banks here do not understand project financing. Very few. People like Stanbic do understand. People like KCB have not understood, but they are funding one of them as we speak today. But the others are getting there. So it is new. And I'm talking about Kenya. If you go to other countries, it's even worse. They've got less understanding that we have here in terms of PPPs. So that's why you're not finding commercial banks operating in there. It's a lack of understanding. And also, their capital base is not very, very strong. The other problem we have in the developing economy, Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, is the issue of liquidity. We don't have adequate liquidity to support the cash requirement, liquidity required by these big projects that we have. So they may take part, but it will be a very small stake, and they need a bit of education as to what PPPs are about.
Okay, thank you. Someone still wants, would like you to clarify inverted, what you're calling the inverted bid funding.
So what I was saying is that this one here, yeah, see, just as the slide says, because I said normally what happens is that the concessionaire will go to a bank or the consortium when they want to bid for a PPP project. They will go to a bank, they'll go to a private equity funds and so on, and say, listen, we got there's this opportunity in Kenya they want to bid for. How much are you going to charge us to lend us in shillings or in dollars, whatever the currency is going to be? So they get what they call a term sheet. So the bank will say, I will lend you Kenya shillings, but at KBRR plus 3 or whatever they are going to add. So they then take that and build their financial model based on that cost of financing. But there is no competition per se, because you'll go to one bank, you go to another bank, and they may not get the best deal possible. And there's also a possibility that after they reach commercial close, and it has happened, that when they go back to that lender who promised them money, the lender says, no. Some of the risk you have taken, they're too risky for me, go back and negotiate. And I gave you an example of KU. So to avoid all this, what the government does, what in this particular case, what they do, they say, banks, we have this project here that we want, and we're looking for funding for it. So they get the banks to bid to finance that project. So you're basically getting the financiers to bid in terms of cost of money. And that way you get the best cost of money. That's why they're calling it an inverted bid model. So you do that before you go out and procure a contractor to do EPC contract, operation and maintenance.
I hope that is, okay, that's clear for me a bit. I think we need to see it working.
Okay.
At the end of the day, and I hope the other thing that we are trying to see is, are there lessons that we are learning about? Okay, I can see the models that you've given us, but as Kenyans or PPP sector, are we looking at lessons learned on the kind of financing that has been adopted and how we can actually modify our own market so that we can take advantage of lessons learned?
The law, the RB Act, I think is being looked at very seriously. So that's one area we're looking at. There is the issue of infrastructure fund, again being looked at as a way of financing. You see, one of the issues with our projects is to do with affordability. So if either we have what they call an availability payment type, where the government is taking on the risk in terms of demand. Maybe let me explain that a bit more. When you talk about availability payment, is that you are telling the concessionaire, give me this facility, give me a hospital, give me hostels. These are the requirements I have. But he will not take the risk in terms of occupancy because you're paying the person a fixed amount of money every quarter. So the risk in terms of occupancy, in terms of demand, remains with the government. The other way of dealing with it, which is to say, you know what, we will want to take some risk in terms of demand, but we'll put in what they call viability gap financing. So the way the government will do that, they will go to an MDB, a material development bank, borrow money, which would be much cheaper than what the commercial banks are going to charge, or from their own taxes, we don't have to always go to MDBs, or their own taxes, and put in a certain amount of money to cover mostly the most expensive part, which is the EPC contract, the actual building of the asset. So that is a mechanism which, again, the government is looking at in terms of creating a fund which will be used to provide viability gap financing.
Okay. I think we can move on. The time is moving.
Yeah.
Next section.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're not looking at, let me look at very, very briefly, because I don't think time is on our side, very briefly on PPPs in Sub-Saharan Africa. You know, how have they performed? What have we learned so far? What is the whole exercise telling us? There is a document which was prepared by a fellow called Yescom. He's one of the gurus in PPPs. And he did that with an NGO based in Tanzania. And they looked at PPPs on the continent up to December 2016 and published this document in 2017. This document is available on the web. Please look for it and read it. I'm just going to summarize very, very briefly what it says and what were the findings. So there are 10 projects here, covering the power sector, covering roads, water supply, storage, covering social infrastructure, which is a hospital, and also government facility. So if just to look at the way we performed, this slide tells a lot. What does it tell you? If you look at when the project was initiated, when we first thought about, to when they eventually reached financial close and started in a build and then started commercial operation, the periods are just shocking in some cases. Bujagali, 1994, commercial operations, 2012. You can do the math. Same power in Ghana, 203, 2018, 15 years. DTA in South Africa, it took 3 years. Why? Because they put in place a legal regulatory framework early. And also, they didn't have to get our friends from the MDB world to get involved. They tend to introduce a lot of delays. Kivu what? 13 years. Lekki Expressway in Nigeria. It took 11 years. But eventually, 3 years down the road, the concession, the thing was cancelled. The government had to go back and buy it from the private party. It wasn't put out together properly. I mean, so if you read, I would encourage you to read the story behind it as to why this happened. The water supply in South Africa took 4 years, not too bad. The highway in South Africa took about 7 years. Could have done better. River railways, I mean, I don't have to say much about this. You know what happened. It was eventually cancelled. Songas power in Songas gas in Tanzania from 1974 to 2004, 30 years. The hospital in Maseru, it took 4 years. But the government don't want it. Why? That hospital is consuming more than 50% of the budget of the Ministry of Health. Maybe let me repeat that. One PPP is consuming 50% of a government budget. And they've been begging the South African government, because the concessionaire is from South Africa, they've been begging the South African government to see how they can, intercede and get this project off their balance sheet. So the issue is this: PPPs are not a silver bullet. They've got their own space where they can be useful. But don't expect them to be fast fix as politicians sometimes think, that it's free money, it's money from the private sector. I'll get this done very, very quickly. The elections are, around the corner. That's PPP is not yours. PPP requires proper identification. PPP requires proper preparation. It requires time. And PPP should be devoid of politics. PPP must be driven by economics. It must make economic sense. And unfortunately, what we don't do adequate cost-benefit analysis when we're looking at our projects. But I'm not talking about Kenya alone, I'm talking about Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, incidentally, I'm doing a PhD on this. So I've been looking at what has been happening on the continent. And the answer I'm looking for is, I'm trying to make sense of why there's lack of traction of PPPs on the continent. So this is what I've been seeing in all academic papers. So basically, it requires attention, dedication, and it should be depoliticized. So what have we learned from these 10 projects? There are a couple of policy issues. Under the general issue is the issue of people don't quite understand the difference between PPP and traditional contracting in terms of procurement. Yeah, they will produce bidding documents which we don't seem to understand how a PPP works, and end of the day, it doesn't go forward. On the committee I've been sitting on, where the last day is tomorrow, I've been there for 6 years. In the procurement of all the cases that came to us, and there are quite a number, the government lost all of them apart from one. Why? Because the procurement process just wasn't being followed properly. If you have rules, follow those rules. PPP will not allow you. I mean, at least, the private money is very sensitive about lack of clarity. If you set your rules, those rules must be maintained. The issue is political support. A PPP requires political support, not political interference, but a lot of support. Why? Because educating the stakeholders to understand that although it is a private party providing the service, they're not ripping you off. Yeah, I've made sure that you're getting value. Need sectoral reforms. PPP cannot exist on its own. It's within an ecosystem. Yeah, so don't just look at 2013, but look at all the other acts which have an impact on PPP and deal with them. In terms of structuring, the issue of affordability, risk transfer. I'm involved in one in the West, where the government is saying, no, the contractor must carry the risk relating to Forex. How? That from day one, it doesn't work. So you need to look at the risks which are reasonable to transfer to the private party. The next thing that the issue is, again, under procurement, governance. Is the process being done properly? Is there a governance structure to ensure that the procurement process is done properly? And so the bids, there are very many, particularly in West Africa. They're all over the place. Are they getting value for money? Half of the time, they don't get completed. I've talked about the issue of currency finance, currency risk. Can we use our local currency? Can we, open up the money sitting with those pension funds, insurance funds, but make sure that, the risk is, well is dealt with to ensure that people don't lose their pensions, but make the money available to develop our infrastructure at a reasonable cost. Issue of construction, yeah? The risk transfer, make sure that it is clear. You be clear about your requirements. If you look at the schedules which are attached to the project agreement, make sure they make sense. Yeah. The other was the issue of operation maintenance in terms of monitoring. What monitoring regime should you have? Should be well defined. Then there is this thing called asset reversal, meaning at the end of the concession period, the assets are supposed to go back to the public entity. Now, PPP is new. How many assets have been handed back? So there is always a promise how to define the process of handback and the status. How should What are they handing back? What should be the quality? We don't have enough experience on that. Still a challenge. So I think I'll stop there. Over to you, Winnie, on that section.
Thank you. Sorry. Any questions or any comments on this, on the issues, policy issues, performance in Sub-Saharan Africa of PPPs? Observations, anything? Okay, for me it would be, South Africa seems to be a bit ahead than most of us. Is there anything that you can actually get from them, as in, even though, do we actually do knowledge transfers with South Africa, or we go to Asia or Europe? Because cultures are also different. I think that tends to affect it, doesn't it, on policy issues and the risk transfers and projects?
Yeah, you see, South Africa seems to work, as I said, because they managed to do things in runs. So the EPC contract is in runs, the revenues or the whatever they correct is in runs. So they kind of get rid of the forest risk. That's number one. Number two, the liquidity. They've got a lot of liquidity. The banks are very liquid. So commercial banks and other banks, they can provide the liquidity required to some extent. The government, until recently, but previously they had the capacity to provide the whatever the required support, they could provide it. I mean, if I give you, for example, the Gautrain. In fact, in terms of EPC contract, if I remember correct, again, I'm going from memory, please don't hold me at that number, but the government contribution to the EPC contract was over 80%. That came from the government coffers. So they've got, it's a bigger economy and they can afford certain things. And for that reason, they seem to move forward. They've also got a very good PPP legal framework. I don't like their manual. It is there. It's very elaborate, but it is it's very difficult to use. But it is there. So the rules are there. So it makes it easier for PPPs to work. Now, do we learn from them? Okay, the circumstances are different. On the recent university hostels bid, we had a South African transaction advisor. That is, I'm talking about Ambu, Moi, and Seku. Basically, when the tenders came in, it turned out that their estimate of the EPC costs was only 30% of what the bidders wanted. Number one. Number two, the bids were very few bids came in. So are we able to learn something from them? I do not know. That's the short answer.
Okay. We can move on as we try and consolidate all the other questions because of time.
Okay, now let's talk about risk. If you remember about the definition of PPP, one of them was a requirement of a significant transfer of risk to the private party for it to justify being procured as a PPP. But what is risk? There isn't a single definition of risk. There are very many which I've listed here. But one of them, which has been updated in the UK under the Orange Book, which is the book on PPPs, is uncertainty of outcome resulting from an action or an event. So it could be a positive opportunity, it could be a negative threat. I find that to me to be probably the best definition of risk. So it looks at the probability of its occurrence and its impact in terms of the consequence of that particular risk. So that's what you're transferring to the private party. And there are two factors, basically likelihood, impact, and then there's a way of basically how do you evaluate it. It's a formula. Two types, as I said, I'm not going to go through all this, but to go what they call endogenous risks, which a private party can do something about, but the exogenous, the ones which basically they cannot. For example, exchange risk. You can talk about getting an exchange swap. The swaps are very, very expensive. Then makes the project unaffordable. And just to go back, if you look at a lot of our public projects, but we were using we have got development partners, we carry the forex risk. We don't pay the World Bank or ADB in shillings, pay them back in dollars. So I've never understood this issue about the forex risks and insisting that the private party carries it. It just makes the project pretty ridiculously expensive for no reason, in my view. So a few examples of risks: you've got site risks in terms of availability, environment, permits, ground conditions, design risks, construction risks, commissioning, revenue risks. I think I've talked about it quite a bit in terms of if it is government pay, okay, that's the government who's going to pay you. But if it is your user pay, then the demand is down, you've got an issue. And then sometime you may fail to provide availability or the quality, in which case then your revenue doesn't come in because payment is made against performance. Then you got your maintenance. This just, there are a lot more risks, just by way of example. Now, what is the rationale for transferring risk? Why are we moving risk from the government to the public party? Well, there are advantages. By doing that, for example, you are sure that delivery is going to be on time. You are sure that you're going to get value for money. But not all the risk can be transferred. Take reputational risk, for example. And this one tends to result into a lot of renegotiations. How is that? Imagine you got an IPP producing power for you and for an area. All of a sudden, that IPP cannot perform. Now, the government cannot allow a whole area to go without power. They've got to step in. So you either step in and take it over and run it, or you go back, renegotiate, and get the fellow to continue. So that one is a risk which the government retains. The issue of fiscal risk, which I've talked about, aggregated affordability, and then the issue of underperformance of the private party. That one, if you choose a bad partner, it's a risk you've assumed, you've got to deal with. But when you're transferring risk or allocating risk, you should bear in mind that there is an optimum level. You cannot just dump all the risks to the private party because the risk equates costs. The more risk the private party takes on board, the more expensive it's going to be or she's going to be. So therefore, this graphic just tells you what happens. At the bottom on the left, that's traditional contracting, where most of the risks are retained by government. But as you move towards the right, you're moving now the risk from the private party from the public party to private party. Then you find that you reach a point where if you go beyond that, then your value for money reduces because the cost from the private party outweigh the benefit you are getting by transferring the risk. So again, engineers who are in the public sector, please always bear that in mind. You cannot transfer all the risk. Look for an optimum solution so you can maximize the value for money. Over to you, Winnie.
I think most of the people are looking at it from, it's like it's a big task ahead for anyone to actually get actual PPP working in this country. So any comments? Most of the comments coming in are mainly on that aspect. Why is PPP looking like a white elephant in sub-Saharan Africa?
Okay. So the question is, can PPP work? PPPs work? Yes, they can work. As I said, but I gave you the example of South Africa. They seem to have worked, but they've got their own peculiar situations there. But even where you're carrying your exchange risk and so on, so long as you prepare, first of all, you've got to choose the right project. Not every project can be a PPP. Not every project. So you've got to choose a project whose cost benefit is significant. So what you want to do is you want to take now advantage of the private sector's innovation to basically even improve on that cost benefit itself. So they can work, but they've got to be, you've got to identify the right project, you've got to prepare them properly, you've got to have a very clean procurement process, then they can work. But if you try and take shortcuts, they will not work.
Quick question on local fiscal framework in Kenya. How flexible is it?
Sorry, I can't hear you, sorry.
How flexible is our local fiscal framework with respect to the Kenya shilling financing? Is it possible? Financing using the Kenya shilling?
Okay, so how is South Africa financing in rands? They've got a very robust construction industry. So unfortunately, here, our local construction industry is not very robust. And what happens is this. A concessionaire will not want to take a risk on an EPC contract because remember, the SPV, that vehicle, the one I call the project company, it is just a shell. Really, it's basically there to deal with finances and so on. It's a shell, doesn't have any capacity other than that. So all the risks that pertain to design, construction, O&M, they're basically a pass-through they're sent to the EPC contractor and O&M contractor. Now, because they know that they've got to pay the lender who wants his money yesterday, they cannot take a risk on an EPC contractor they do not know. An EPC contractor doesn't have a track record on PPPs. So they tend to bring in contractors from overseas who have done PPPs. So South Africa, they have them. They've done PPPs, local capacity. They can use local ones and pay them in rands. If you bring a contractor from Spain, a contractor from whatever, Portugal, whatever it is, they won't accept shillings. Even if they take shillings, the question is, can our forex reserve sustain all that? I'm not. Well, you can hedge by saying, I'll take shillings, but I'll hedge, but it makes it unaffordable. So generally what tends to happen is that they will want some payment in foreign currency or the government takes on the forex risk. So in terms of capacity, it's an issue. It's an issue.
Okay. But we can continue. I can see most of the questions coming in. You're going to cover in the next slides, and then we can actually take them all together.
Okay, so actually there are very few left. So let me, in terms of expertise, I thought I'd just break it into three. A concessionaire, the people actually package projects together. It's a business, so it's an entrepreneur basically. They look at an opportunity and say, what, I can make money here. So they'll go out and put together teams. They'll get people of like mind to join them as in the consortium. Then they'll go out and get a designer. They'll go out, somebody to basically do the feasibility for them. They'll go out and get a finance person to run the financial. They'll get a lawyer to look at the legal framework. They'll get an environmentalist to look at the environmental issues and so on. So as far as the concessionaire is concerned, our role as engineers will come in basically in terms of designing the project. If we're responding to an RFP, we look at the RFP and come up with the most efficient design. If you look at the EPC contractor, he's got the responsibility of looking at the end products defined by the employer's requirement, basically in the schedule, and they make sure that they produce a detailed design, which meets those requirements, both from the perspective of building the project and also the issue of operation and maintenance. You want to minimize the amount of O&M which is required. So we come in basically to produce efficient designs. When it comes to O&M, the engineering requirements may not be that onerous because a lot of the thinking will have been done during construction. But there may be, if you're looking at the concession of 30 years or thereabouts, there will be changes. There may be requirements to do some redesigns, or there could be new methods that come on board, and they can maybe reduce O&M costs by adopting a different mechanism. So yes, engineers will be required at that point to provide some kind of value engineering. You look at what has been designed before, you see, how can I tweak it? How can I improve it so that my O&M costs are lower? So basically those are the skills which are required. And then there is a piece I've not included when it comes to the actual construction. You will need somebody to, they call them the independent engineer. And he'll be basically the person who's advising both the project company and the employer regarding performance of the project company. Basically, it's to do with meeting the requirements of project agreement. Also, at the back of that, you'll have the lenders. They tend to have their own engineer who comes and basically check to see, has the construction been done properly? Fine. We can release payment to the project company. So those are the skills which are required. Now, what have I found in my experience? It is always good if you're going to be in this space. Not only do you need to have a good understanding of design, construction, and construction management, but additional skills like finance and accounting are very useful. Financial modeling is very useful. Some legal training is useful, because then it makes it easier for you to discuss with the other people. If you're discussing with the finance person and they are questioning you about their financial model, saying, you know, why this cost, you're able to understand where they're coming from. If you're putting together the bid documents and the lawyer is trying to, you know, it's got issues with some of them, you're able to understand where they're coming from. So it is recommended that you do acquire those skills. You don't have to go and do a degree, but you can take courses so that you understand, you know, something about finance and something about law. Over to you, Winnie.
I think I hope it's clear to the engineers their role and the kind of expertise are going to play in the PPP. And I think, okay, there are roles and within the PPP. And one of the things I think you should have, should be highlighted is that engineers can also be master planners in the whole infrastructure development. And as I said, the thing is, I don't know whether the curriculum should be changed. Those knowledge areas of finance, law, maybe it can be introduced even in the university level, at least to get a background of that kind of information. Let's just finish for now, and then we can go back and capture most of the questions that have been coming in. Is that okay? I can't say anything more next.
Yeah.
We can.
Yes, it's okay.
Yeah, that is fine, because we are moving towards 6 p.m. too. Let's just continue.
Okay, so I'll do very quickly, just to, actually 2 aspects I'm covering, issue of Acek, EBK, and IEK. The way I see it is that it's to do with capacity building. And capacity building at different levels. Acek, you're looking at building consultants. In other words, the aspect of how do you manage a design process? How do you manage, you know, a construction supervision and so on? EBK looks at all of us, the engineer as an individual, the engineer as a consultant, and so on. So again, they could create requirements which, because really, if you look at our market today, it is changing. You know, we talk about PPP today, but there is something else happening at the same time. We're seeing a lot of design and build projects coming along. Okay, and design and build is actually more or less EPC. It's what PPP requires. But even outside the PPP framework, under traditional contracting, we are seeing EPC contracts coming through. So I think there is need for that realization to come about, so that our training is kind of focused to understand what is happening to the market structure, which is changing towards EPC type of construction. So that you're not just saying, oh, no, I'm a consultant, I'm just a designer, I supervise. But there is more, because very soon our employers are going to become contractors, not the government entities. And contractors, they've got different requirements. You're going to carry different risk profile. You under design, it costing the contractor money, you better have a very good PI, you know. So So the same thing applies to IK as well. So just think that maybe when we're looking at the training programs we're promoting in terms of CPDs, take into consideration what I talked about, the issue of the other disciplines, your finance, your accounting, your legal. Somehow see how that can be brought in. If you do such a course, it is recognized under CPD. Let's engage universities. I'm now going to IEK, engage universities in terms of curriculum to see whether what is being taught, is what the market is asking for. But we are now operating the market, we understand the market better. So we can feed that back into the university curriculum. So that's really all I can say about the role of ASEC, EBK, and IEK.
Continue. Let's finish up and then we can.
Okay, so the issue of the future of PPPs in Sub-Saharan Africa, I think the future is bright. Why am I saying it is bright? We are going to be pushed into a corner where we'll have to get our houses in order so we can attract private finance. We need to get our people out of poverty. And one quick way of doing it is by developing infrastructure. To develop infrastructure, we need private finance. For private finance to come, we need to create an environment which encourages private finance. I think the things I've been discussing over the last 2 hours maybe touch on that. So the onus is on our policymakers, it's on our bureaucrats to basically create that environment. What the government has become today when it comes to PPPs, they are marketers. They are marketing projects. They package projects and market them to the private sector. And if you're going to market something as a marketeer, you've got to create an environment where there will be a buyer. So I believe we're getting there. We should not despair. We're going through the pain, but I'm quite bullish. Another, say, 5-10 years, we should be seeing a fairly robust PPP environment or PPP industry on the continent. And the very last one, if anybody wants to learn more, because I just touch on PPPs, but if anybody wants to learn a bit more about PPPs, there is a program run by APMG. So this was developed by APMG with the support of the World Bank. It's got 3 parts to it: a foundation course, preparation. Preparation is to do with how do you identify, how do you develop, how do you go to tender, and so on. And then execution is when you've awarded, how do you manage the project. So it's a certification program, quite useful. This entity called IPPI is now what they call an ATO, an accredited training organization. It's among probably the only 3 on the continent. We're right here in Nairobi. If you're interested, please do come and join us, and we can do more training the one we have now is going to be a 4-day program, and there will be an exam that you can take and get an accredited certificate. Okay, then, Winnie, I'm done, and I'm ready for any questions that there might be.
Thank you. And thank you very much. It was a very good presentation. As you said, PPP is quite wide, and don't think we can be able to cover everything, especially in depth, in less than 2 hours. And as we can see, there are quite a number of questions which come back to risks, financing, and several projects. So the first one, I think I can start off, if that is okay.
Sure.
So a question came in on did the privatization on PPC. Sorry, I'm looking for a question. I saw it somewhere here. In PPP, as in the question is the client, the employer, how do they track the project in terms of quality assurance? And is this usually covered within the clauses within the PPP contract itself?
Yes, there is what we call the independent engineer who's supposed to certify that the project company is meeting the requirements which are set out in the project agreement. The project agreement will have a series of schedules which go to performance, quality, and so on. But believe me, that is not the biggest entity that looks after quality. The person with the biggest, if I may use the word, the biggest rungu is the financier. The financier is carrying the biggest risk, okay? Because if that project does not generate any revenue or the cash flow which is expected, they will never get their money paid. So they tend to have what they call the lender's engineer, who also checks on quality. So there are those two, the independent engineer, and there is the lender's engineer who basically makes sure that the quality is met. The client, quite frankly, they are really not, I will not say they're not bothered, but they know that there is enough mechanism within the PPP framework to ensure that quality is achieved.
Thank you. Yeah, as you said, it's more of risk transfer. As you said, PPP is about risk transfer. And yes, as you said, the rungu is who has the money, if I may ask that question.
Exactly.
Another question is coming in on roads, tolling. Is it, how do I put it? Is it required that whenever you're tolling a road within the Kenyan context, if you can be asked, that you're supposed to provide an alternative route, i.e. the government responsibility? Or you can toll the road and it doesn't matter whether there are other accesses available?
I have, okay, I can just limit myself to the PPP Act. The PPP Act does not require that the government provides an alternative route. There may be other provisions of the constitutions and so on, but as far as the Act is concerned, it doesn't make that provision. There's no such a provision.
Okay, so it's not a must within the but it's good for the government.
It is not a requirement of the PPP Act. It is not.
Okay. Political instability. As you're saying, the country has to market itself so that the PPP projects can actually be successful. So question coming in is how can the contractors be shielded from political instability, especially in Kenya while implementing the PPP project?
First of all, we are not in a stable country to start with. Okay, so that is not there. But there is a thing called a partial risk guarantee. First of all, let me go back. That letter of comfort does cover political risk. So in other words, if there is an issue like that, then the government picks it up. Say, for example, if say the project cannot proceed because you go riots, there is some political whatever it is, and the road has to be closed, and nobody's using the road, so you're not collecting any fees for a couple of weeks, then you can rely on that partial risk guarantee that the government has taken out to cover some of your cash flow requirements, actually credit risk. So who provides that partial risk guarantee? It's mostly MDBs. The World Bank has got a window thing called the MIGA that can provide some kind of insurance, covers political risk. ADB to provide PRG, they provide one for Lake Turkana, that's provided by ADB. So yes, some risks are covered. But what is the biggest risk, the biggest insurance? The biggest insurance is to make sure that your legal system works, is make sure that the governance system works. That is the best assurance you can ever give concessionaires. The partial risk guarantee or the political risk guarantee from MIGA, yes, it's some kind of a comfort. But to me, that's not what we should be focusing. We should be focusing on creating systems that work, that will give long-term comfort to concessionaires.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification and opinion on that one. So we come back to more technical aspect of the project. PPPs, if they do experience variation in cost and time, they can do that. Who benefits? Is it allowed for within the PPP Act? If, let's say they estimated this is the cost for construction, but they do it for less. who is covered, or if it's more, who pays?
Okay, first of all, and that's the beauty about PPPs. If you remember, I talked about the issue of avoiding delays. So the PPP is fixed price, if I may call that, firm price, not fixed price, firm price and fixed time. So there should not be a time overrun. If there's time overrun, somebody's going to pay for it, not the government. The government is going to charge for that because of the service not being provided. Cost overrun. If it's to do with underestimation of the cost by EPC contractor, first of all, the government is not involved in that at all. It's a matter between the project company and the EPC contractor to sort it out. But the law does provide for variations. You may vary your requirements. So in other words, talk about the schedule to the peer, the project agreement, which sets out the requirements. You may decide that, I only wanted the road to do of such and such capacity, but I think I want to increase it, or whatever. You may set to increase the standards. So for that one, it will be a variation for which the project company will be compensated. And the act does provide for it.
Thank you. Another question on conclusion of our procurement process for PPP. With the exception of financing, is there anything else that is affecting the process of conclusion? If you're in the PPP, by the time it's advertised and as in from your performance, from the performance of PPPs, there's a long period. So with the exception of financing, financial closure, what is affecting what can be done to reduce that lengthy duration?
Okay, first of all, let's not be too harsh on ourselves. Quite frankly, we are learning. And we're making our mistakes. Now, let me talk about my experience on the petition committee. What were the biggest problems? One, documentation, at least the ones I looked at. I can talk about this because once it comes to us, it becomes a public document. So the bid document, the way they were prepared, in my view, was hurried. They were inconsistent. When it came to the procurement process itself, when they went to tender, they were, shall we say, inability to comply with their own documents. In some cases, they will introduce requirements which are not there. So all those things introduce, complaints and so on. The other one is the actual process itself in the law. Because let me just run through very quickly. So you've got the contracting authority who decides, I think I've got a good project here, and they produce a brief, some document that goes to the unit. The unit look at it and say, we think it's not bad. I mean, that can be developed. I think it makes sense. Then, they go ahead and if they don't have capacity, then they get a TA to assist them to develop. And once that is developed, then it's going to go through another process, comes back to the unit. From the unit, it goes to the committee, and all that takes time. So it's quite long. The process is long. Maybe there could be areas that could be made shorter. But I think for now, it is long, and maybe it is justifiably long because we are on a learning curve. So to me, it's a combination of we are learning about the process. Our law is still infant. It's still being tested. There is lack of capacity, in my view, in some of the procuring entities. They don't quite understand the process well enough. All those things put together do cause delay. Some of them have been going on for, I don't know, I think one that I know is going for about 5 years before we even reach commercial close. So don't even talk about financial close. We're still discussing, negotiating, haven't closed yet. So it is, look, as I said, let's be fair to ourselves. We're learning.
That's going to be for how long?
Well, we're getting experience. We're getting better at it.
I need a project. Question, projects that are PPP. We've seen telecoms had been there some time back. Now we are more on energy. Why is it that you're avoiding, or there are less projects on water, roads? As you said, I know there's value for money and cost benefit analysis, but some of the areas within Africa or even in Kenya, coming to get the actual economic benefit of a project in terms of profit is going to be very hard. So what can be done on these projects, especially water, sewers, and even roads?
I think for those sectors, viability gap financing, in my view, will be necessary because of the affordability issue. You know, if you want, okay, let's go back the other way. I think the government has got an obligation to provide, say, clean water to everyone, to the extent possible. So if they don't have 100% of the money to develop that water system, only have 20%, why don't they use that 20% to, as a viability gap financing, to enable that project to go forward and still make it affordable? So I think it's something that can be considered, where you're chipping in, use the cost of the EPC.
Sorry, Paul, you're breaking.
Affordable. So in
Hello?
my view, things like say, I say in my view, am I okay now?
Yeah.
Even now?
And now you're fine.
You cannot hear me?
Now we can.
Okay. So I'm saying, in my view, some of those sectors, they require some what they call viability funding, so that the cost becomes affordable. The risks become affordable. Now, if you look at for some reason, people kind of accept you get a bill on question pay. It's something, I don't know why. But if you charge the cost recovery level, say for a water project, people will be up in arms. They will not pay for it. So I think it's also something to do with the society, where we probably see water as public good, and yet power is not a public good. So I think also education is probably necessary. Get people to understand, if you want clean water, if you want, to avoid being sick because of consuming water is not clean, then pay a bit more. But don't make it too expensive. So something has to be gradual.
Thank you. Switching, okay. Another question is on transparency and competition in PPP. How can you rate it? And then there's, I don't know, most of the projects are not so, as you say, public information it's public information, but it's not public information. How would you rate, or how would you actually work around that?
Okay, let's first of all define what is public information. The public information is when you've actually signed, you've already signed the project agreement. That is when you're supposed to provide certain information. But the rest of the process is very much a confidential process, because you've got to safeguard the builders in terms of their proprietary information and so on. Now, the question is it competitive? Because we're an infant market. There is a lot of competition for private finance all over. So when you look at a new place where the law is new, the people in the side are not very familiar. There are very few people who have time to come. But they will come eventually. We just need to have a few successes. The power sector has been running slow. Okay, we've had near 26 years of experience in the power sector, and that is why we find that there is a lot of demand for people bring and sorts of proposals to do solar, to do wind, and so on, because we have a track record. So even the other sectors, water, roads, they will come, but we have to build a track record.
Okay. I think most of them have been Most of the questions of the chat have been covered, unless there's something I'm missing or anyone raising a hand. I can't. Anyone? Any additional question that I've not captured? Okay, people are awfully quiet.
Winnie?
Yes?
Winnie? There's a question here.
Okay.
Winston is asking if you could kindly repeat how broadly value for money is calculated in PP projects.
Okay. I wish I had put up a graphic. Okay, so basically, what are you trying to achieve? You're trying to say, if the government did a job, produced the assets. Let's talk about a road or water supply. If the government built this water supply system and ran it for 30 years, what would be the cost to government? So there'd be the cost of the design, there'd be the cost of construction, there'd be the cost of operation and maintenance. But the other cost which the government also has, for example, insurance. Maybe the government doesn't take insurance, but if something goes wrong, the government uses tax money to replace them and so on. So that is one cost stream. What does it cost the government? Then you go to the private party saying, I am going to do the same system for you. For you, it is costing you 100. For me, it's actually going to cost you, if you give it to me, it's going to cost you 120. So on the face of it, you say, oh, the private party is too expensive. It's 20, whatever it is, more than to cost the government. But that is not true because you're not comparing like with like. If you go to say, that 120 has assumed certain risks which will normally stay with the government. The risk with the government is not factored in the outlay, the 100 that the government pays, because the government will only account for what it pays out, cash. But the other risks which are covered elsewhere, they are not captured. So what you do, you take that government cost, you then adjust it for the risks which are being transferred to the private party. And that adjustment may then make the government cost after you adjust it for risk to be maybe 130. Now you compare 130 and 120. The difference is 10 positive. So the value for money, you'll be saying, it will have cost the government 130, but the private sector is going to do it for 120. So therefore, the value for money is 10. I better go to the private party. On the other hand, if you find that by the government, if the government did it, and the private party came with, say, a figure of 140, and you adjust the government and come to 130, then you find that the government will be paying an extra 10 to the private party, which is above what will have cost it, then the value for money is negative. So you don't do a PPP, you go for traditional contracting. I hope that is clear.
I think that's been answered. We come back to build, own, operate.
Yes.
Comes back. Is it a form of PPP?
Build, own?
Build, own, operate, and transfer.
No, that's definitely a PPP. And why is it a PPP? Again, remember the issue, the definition of PPP. There is an operation which means long-term. So it's a long-term contract. Are you transferring risk, significant risk to the contractor? Yes. Maybe you don't have the financing element, but you've transferred significant risk. Yes. PPP does not necessarily mean that all the financing, means the upfront cost, 100% must come from the private sector. You can have a PPP where the financing is from government 100%, but you transfer other risks, long-term, O&M, design, construction, etc. It makes it a PPP. Now, when you come to certain definitions, like the definition of APMG, then they reckon that there must be a financing element in addition. And that one is targeted towards what we call the emerging developers. And there's enough
Hello.
very
Sorry.
gains and so on.
Paul,
So you
sorry.
find that financing must be part of the requirement for it to be a PPP, but generally it doesn't have to be.
Sorry, Paul. I think the last section it was not clear.
Can
So
you
you
hear
got off.
me?
Yes, I think your connection is poor. Hello. Hello.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
You're breaking.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
we were saying, I think you might need to repeat the last portion of what you said.
Yeah, when I was saying that I was talking about the issue of financing. For example, if you look at our own definition, our act does not talk about finance. It doesn't. So under our act, you can have a PPP which does not financing from the private sector, but you must have the other elements. It must be a long-term contract. You must, basically transfer significant risks such as construction, design, etc. But financing is not necessarily a requirement under our act.
Thank you. So I think we are coming to an end. There are two questions. One is a question and one is more of an opinion they're seeking from you. One is, what do you think about the impact of the lack of data? I think it's something that we have an issue in these parts of the world. How does that affect the impact of the lack of reliable or up-to-date data sets for PPP, especially in roads, in traffic projection? What can be done to address this? Then as a closing, an opinion is being sought on PPP. It's been marketed as for more complex and only big projects, which comes out as more discouraging and daunting, becomes a complex task for many to envisage. And so what do you think? Can this be broken down, or can we have small projects, at least so that you can actually see a success?
Okay, let me do the first one. So what was that again, the first one? I think
impact of data, lack of data.
Yeah, so the data has got two impacts. You see, when you're talking about value for money, for example, and talking about how much it will cost the government, you're assuming that there are costs which exist, reliable costs. So quite frankly, we don't have reliable costs, because we may have costs coming from tenders, recent tenders, but that's only part of the equation. The other costs which we don't have. So it makes the whole exercise of value for money from a cost perspective a bit tenuous. Yeah, it's subjective. So what you then do, you have to look at other metrics such as social and so on. That's one. It is true, when it comes to things like, say, reliable traffic data and the like, we don't have it. So therefore, what happens? We end up with very high bids because the bidders will have to basically put in a contingency because the data, historical data, is not sufficient. It's not, we don't have the bank of data is not robust enough. So the impact of that is that the costs that we end up getting, they've got a huge, quite a high contingency in there, built in, because of possible variations. So yes, I agree with you, lack of data is an issue. So what can we do about it? We need to invest. We need to invest in producing data. We need to invest in making data easily affordable. Now in the age of IT, it can be done. It's just a matter of deciding to do so. That's number one. The other question was the issue of PPPs. Now, one thing you should bear in mind, if you saw the process of PPPs, it's not a short process. It's a long process. It's expensive. I will just give you an example, and I won't mention roads, the particular road, but there's a road which I'm aware of. And to develop the PPP proposal alone, you are looking at an expenditure of the upward of $5 million US. Just the proposal. Why? You've got to do your traffic, you've got to do your design, you've got to do your legal due diligence, you've got to do your tax due diligence. I mean, you've got a battery of people who are involved in the process. It's very expensive. So now, it doesn't matter the size of project. Whether it is 200 kilometers or 50 kilometers, the inputs may be the same. Okay, the design may be a bit less, but the other inputs may be the same. So in my view, PPP, small projects don't engender them well for PPPs because the cost of developing the PPP is very expensive, both to the contracting authority and the bidders themselves. So really we should be looking at large projects. And by the way, that is what Africa 50 is doing now. They are focusing on financing big, massive projects that will have economic impact. That's what we should be looking, big projects.
Thank you so much. I think I'll have to cut it off at this point and hand over back to our host, but I have to say thank you to everyone who was here and to remind the engineers. I think from what I've gotten from this PPP is, yes, we know there's PPP procurement, but also one thing that you have to be ready for is that we have to change our mindset. The future of work of how we are going to be able to actually penetrate this market and also to ensure that the success of these projects, we'll have to adopt a new mindset of how we are going to be working. But again, thank you. As you said, there's going to be a foundation course accredited that will be carried out. You'll see from the presentation that will be forwarded to you from next week. It's saying 2nd of June to the 5th of June.
Correct.
So everyone is welcome to attend. You can contact him. And then I say thank you, and I hand over to Nancy and Latoya.
Thank you, Winnie. I think mine would just be to say thank you. This is still part of what we are doing, and more of it Engineer Latoya will talk about. This is training still organized by the future leaders for Acek, the future leaders for Acek. Future leaders for Acek is actually still under Acek. I think still Engineer Nduga and Engineer Latoya would say that. More training still to come on, each one training per month. We'll still be reaching out to the experts. We'll float a subject for the month of July or June, and then we'll still reach out. And to the participants and all the time support, asanteni sana. Over to you, Latoya.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Engineer Karekezi, for your very insightful webinar. Thank you so much, Winnie, for moderating the webinar. Thank you so much. Also, we'd like to thank the support from Acek, our parent organization, giving us the support, and as you know that Engineer Karekezi is a member of Acek, so they provide the speakers, and I'm glad that you all enjoyed. Hope to see you soon. The presentation will be sent via email for those who registered and for those who have attended. The presentation and the recording. We'll also discuss and send you future webinars, the same platform. So just keep your eye open. And yes, thank you and have a good evening. So I will hand over now to the president of Acek, Engineer Henry Nduga.
Thank you, Latoya. I've seen everybody trying to leave. Mine is to just give a vote of thanks. First, Paul, we're privileged to have you. It was a very privileged discussion. Thank you very much for giving insights on PPP to the engineers. For all the participants who found time to be with us, we're very grateful. We appreciate the effort you've made to stay for all these, I believe, 2.5 hours. We hope to have you soon. For the future leaders, thumbs up. We want to see more of this, please. We want to see more of the relevant discussion. This was very insightful. We've seen through PPP still quite a bit. We still have a lot to go through to start implementing PPP projects. And with the knowledge we have within Acek, Paul Karekezi to be specific, we believe this information can go out so that those who are trying to figure out how to implement PPP projects should have information. We know one of our engineers heads the PPP sections at the Treasury. We probably would have him next speaking to us so that we have more insight. I believe from the information we've got from Engineer Karekezi, we still have a lot to share. So on behalf of Acek, my name is Engineer Henry Nduga. I'm currently chair of the Acek Council. I'm a consulting engineer with Batch Associates. Because of the curfew, I won't say more, but to say thank everybody who's participated in this. Thank everybody who has made this possible. Thank Mr. Engineer Karekezi for having a nice presentation. Amigos.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.